Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Two rebellious guests join us to celebrate Independence Day who couldn't be more different. In the second half of our show, retired Detective Howard Cowboy Wooldridge, co-founder of an organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, tells us how he rode his horse across America to end the failed war on drugs. Up first, we're pleased to welcome the most renowned scholar of the American Revolution, Gordon Wood, Professor Emeritus at Brown University. Professor Wood won the Pulitzer-Prize in History for The Radicalism of the American Revolution, one of his many books covering that period. Gordon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Gordon, among historians, you call yourself a simple hedgehog. Why?
Well, it was a comparison that Isaiah Berlin made between hedgehogs and foxes, going back to what a Greek philosopher had said. And hedgehogs have one big idea, and foxes have many, many small ideas. And I really only had one big idea in my career, was writing about the revolution, the revolutionary era. So that's why I refer to myself as a hedgehog compared to many people who are foxes.
Well, you've become the world expert. When you began your life's work, the progressive interpretation of the American Revolution was predominant. Remind us what this view espoused and how it was abandoned in the 50s and 60s.
Well, the progressive interpretation started in the progressive era, and that's why it's called that, and essentially emphasized a class interpretation of the founding of America. The leader was Charles Beard, and what he liked to do was get rid of all the ideas on top, which he felt were masking the economic realities that lay beneath the surface. It was part of the general realism of the early 20th century. Marx and Freud and others were asserting that the reality lay beneath the surface in the back rooms, and you couldn't understand an event if you looked at what people said.
And after World War II, how did historians sort of reinterpret things?
I think historians, probably led by Edmund Morgan, began asserting that these ideas did count and that what people said really mattered, and they began to emphasize once again the no taxation without representation as a cause of the American Revolution.
Well, talk to us in general about the importance of ideas in moving history, as well as their limitation as an explanatory force.
Well, ideas are important because we're human beings, and we give meaning to everything we do, and those meanings are ideas. They may be rationalizations, they may be excuses, they may be justifications, but we don't do anything without giving it meaning. And so I think ideas can never be separated from behavior in any simple manner.
And what are their limits?
Well, obviously, people do hide what they really feel in many cases. They aren't always honest. We see that with politicians. They're disingenuous. They say what they think will win them votes. So you have to be careful in interpreting what people say because they may have hidden motives. I think there's no doubt that the progressives were right about that. It's just that you can't dismiss the ideas out of hand.
How do ideas differ from propaganda?
Well, that's a good point, and they, in some sense, they don't. You just can't turn off and turn on your ideas as simple propaganda, which is usually referred to as organized lying, I suppose, by the state. So I think we can't really hide or dissemble as easily as the state can with propaganda, because somehow or other we've got to be consistent. We want each of us to be persuasive, and if you're totally jumping around with your ideas, then nobody's going to believe you.
Back in the 18th century, monarchy was the standard of the age. It was normal and accepted, and yet many educated people spoke highly of the virtues of the ancient Roman Republic. What role did the history of Rome play in the shaping of the American Revolution?
Oh, very important. I think Rome was not just for Americans, but for 18th century enlightened people. They looked back to Rome. Well, they were fascinated by it. Why did Rome fall? This was the greatest civilization for centuries, and it died.
We're asking that again today.
That's right. And there's always that sense that they wanted to find out what killed it off and what's the source of political health. And in fact, I think they thought of history as a kind of autopsy of the past. You cut open these dead republics, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, to find out what killed them in order to decide what's good political health. And I think that's what fascinated the 18th century world, not just the Americans, but the English, the French, and others.
And when they boiled down the good parts of the Roman Republic as a model, what did they find?
Well, they found that what made Rome succeed was the virtue of its people. And then when it died, it was because they lost that virtue. It had become corrupted. They became too luxury-loving, and they lost the will to defend their state. When Rome began hiring mercenary soldiers, that was a fateful decision. So they had a whole bunch of symptoms of decline that the 18th century discovered, usually just borrowing from the writings of the great Latin writers, Tacitus in particular.
Among the virtues held in high esteem by the revolutionaries was, of course, liberty. Talk to us a bit about the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty.
By positive liberty, and those are distinctions that are modern, they didn't draw that distinction, but by positive liberty, they meant liberty of the community, doing good for the whole community. By negative liberty, they meant what we mean pretty much by liberty is individual rights, separate from the government, something that's your freedom from being imposed upon. So that the two kinds of liberty were in a certain amount of tension, although many people thought that if you could have positive liberty, that is meaning the people in control of the government, there would be no problem, because how would the people tyrannize themselves?
So wasn't the fear of people tyrannizing themselves all about the constraints the founders put on democracy?
Yes, eventually, but at the outset they didn't anticipate that. During a debate in Massachusetts in 1775, John Adams and Daniel Leonard were debating what was happening, and Leonard, who was a Tory and later a loyalist, said, watch out for these congresses and these conventions you're creating. They're going to become tyrannical. And Adams said, no, that's ridiculous. It's illogical. A democratic despotism is a contradiction in terms. Well, 10 years later, Adams had changed his mind quite a bit.
Yeah.
They just didn't anticipate that a majority rule could be tyrannical.
You write that the American colonists were not an oppressed people, that they were freer than pretty much any people on earth back in the 18th century, and I might add freer than we are today. The Tories thought the revolution was mad. By contemporary standards, were they right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by... They certainly were not an oppressed people, and they certainly had a higher standard of living, with the exception of the black slaves, a higher standard of living than any people in the world. But oppression is a funny thing. You can feel oppressed even if you're materially well off. What they feared was the threat that England posed by its various actions in the 1760s. Because once you allow them to tax you, and they're 3,000 miles away, then your property and your lives are in the hands of people whom you have no control over. So they had a legitimate complaint about that.
The revolutionaries seemed driven as much by paranoia over a comprehensive conspiracy to encroach on their freedoms rather than by any acts of tyranny, as you just pointed out. How widespread was this mindset amongst the general population?
Well, I think that it went pretty deep. I think that's what we're finding out. In the fall of 1774 in Massachusetts, for example, there was a rumor that spread that the English had fired upon, now this is 6 months before Concord and Lexington, that fired on Americans, and about 15,000 Minutemen from Connecticut and New Hampshire and western Massachusetts converged on Boston. It's an extraordinary outpouring of people, and then they realized the rumor was false, and they all went back to their homes. But the fact that you could bring out that number of people just out of a rumor shows you that the feelings that Americans had about the threat the British posed, I think, was real.
If you examine the rhetoric of the revolutionaries through the speeches and pamphlets that have come down to us, you have to marvel at the way they spoke about reason while they were skillfully inflaming the passions of the mob. How did they sustain these passions through the long years of war?
It was difficult, but they had a much more deferential society than we have today, and people tended to defer, although the New Englanders were much more raucous and challenging of authority than, say, Virginians or Southerners. But nonetheless, it was not easy to control. Washington had lots of problems with mutiny in his army, and he was a pretty tough disciplinarian, executing soldiers, keeping them in line. So it was not an easy task.
How many loyalists actually ended up fleeing the country in fear of the mob?
Well, there were about 500,000 loyalists, about 500,000, and about probably 80,000 actually left the country
Mm-hmm.
for other parts of the British Empire, Canada in particular, but to Jamaica, and then many went, of course, to England. And then some of the black African Americans were finally sent to Lyon in Africa.
The Revolutionary War was the longest war in American history prior to the Vietnam War, and the outcome seemed to be in doubt through most of that time. When did people reach the point in believing that they actually might win it?
Actually, that's hard to... I think lots of people... Jefferson, for example, thought we were okay by 1777. He was... Saratoga convinced him, and the French alliance convinced him that there's nothing that the British could do. I think there was a good deal of confidence, even in the setbacks that Washington had. I think the lowest point was probably November of 1776, when Washington had been driven out of New York and been driven into New Jersey. That made the importance of the Battle of Trenton all that more, all more meaningful.
As every school kid learns American history, that does seem to be the turning point.
Yes, I think psychologically that showed that Washington was not going to be constantly running and retreating and losing. Even though it was a small tactical victory, it had a tremendous psychological effect.
Gordon, when the British finally surrendered, the Americans must have been very much like the dog that caught the bus. Fill us in a bit on the years between victory at Yorktown and the drafting of the Constitution. What was going on in the newly independent country?
Well, you're quite right that there was a crisis in the 1780s because they had drafted constitutions in 1776, state constitutions, each state. And we have to keep in mind that when people talked about my country in 1776, they meant Massachusetts or Virginia. There's a very little sense yet of Americanism, of the United States. It was more like the EU today. So people's loyalties were to their states. And so the state constitutions were very important. They're more important in some sense than the federal constitution because the federal constitution is derived from the state constitutions. But at any rate, they gave so much power to the state legislatures, the popular legislatures, and weakened the governors so much that you had a crisis of what you might call excesses of democracy in the 1780s. And this led people like James Madison to rethink some of the assumptions of 1776. We've given too much power to the people, and we need to correct that. And he saw the federal constitution as a means of limiting the power of the state legislatures. Now, one other suggestion was many people said, well, we just got to go back towards monarchy, move towards a authoritarian leader, and people suggested that Washington, for example, should become a dictator. But Madison didn't want to go in that direction. As he said, I want a Republican remedy for Republican ills. And so the federal constitution becomes that remedy. In various ways, the federal constitution limited the states. Madison felt so strongly about this that he wanted the federal government, the Congress, to have a veto power over all state legislation, all state bills. Well, that was so impractical that he couldn't convince his colleagues. And they ended up with Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which prohibits the states from doing certain things. For example, states can't print paper money, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, we're seeing what that's like now.
Yeah, right.
During the formulation of the Constitution, a great battle was fought between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. That resulted in the Constitution we still pay lip service to today. Put that battle in context for us.
Well, most people were very mistrustful of far-removed political power. It's incredible. Nobody in 1776 anticipated the kind of national government that was created 10 years later. It was just beyond their ken. So it was difficult to convince people that this was essential. They had, all theory was opposed to it. Montesquieu, the great French philosophe, said republics have to be small in territory, homogeneous. You can't have a large territory because the republic would fall apart. People would run off in different directions. And I think we're finding that out today with the Arab Spring and other experiences. It's very difficult to maintain democracy unless your people are very self-disciplined. And that's what they feared. They thought that this would be tyrannical. The only way you can deal with a population over a large territory is through strong executive authority. And so that's what they feared. There was some logic to that. And the president was given an enormous amount of power as we know, Article 2 is very vague, but the president has, as we've seen over the last 200 plus years, has exerted an enormous amount of power.
And a power that ever grows.
That's right. And wartime conditions have been the source of most of that growth.
You know, it's often said that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson represent the two poles of founding American thought, the former supporting commercial interests and a vigorous central government, and the latter championing a more atomized agrarian society with a deep distrust of government. You know, the pendulum of history swings, but it looks like Alexander Hamilton has had the last word. Is there anything left of Thomas Jefferson's ideals?
Well, I think there is, because he had this tremendous trust in the people, and he believed that everyone at heart had a moral sense and could be trusted. And that sense of the equality, everyone, all men are born equal, those are so fundamental to being an American that Jefferson, even though he was an aristocratic slaveholder, nonetheless, Jefferson still lives. He has to live, or our democracy would die. If we didn't believe that all men are created equal, if we didn't believe that the people are the repository, the ultimate repository of power, then the country would be completely changed.
Gordon, allow me a personal question. I've been on a quest to get a history question answered, and I think I'm going to give up if you can't do it. I recall once reading about a conversation between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in which Jefferson opined that the British system would be the best ever devised were it not for the corruption, and to which Hamilton replied that it was the corruption that made it work. Did I imagine reading that, or did it really happen?
No, it's Adams who said that. Adams said the British Constitution would be the best if only the corruption were limited. They're at a dinner party with Jefferson, Adams, and Hamilton. Mm-hmm. Jefferson said that the British Constitution is totally wrong. And Adams replied, no, it's great if only he could get rid of the corruption. And Hamilton actually, much more shrewdly, said, no, it's the corruption that makes it work. And of course what he meant was that the ministry controlled the House of Commons, and essentially Hamilton was speaking what David Hume had already said. He saw how the future of the English system, which is based on the ministry having a majority in the House of Commons, and of course the way they got that majority was to essentially corrupt it. The Crown was appointing people to offices and so on. So Hamilton is the one who sees the thing rightly, but it's Adams who says, yeah, it would be fine if we got rid of the corruption.
Thanks for correcting me on that. It's been a mystery. Thinking about the social evolution of Americans, as Americans, how important was the abolition of entail and primogeniture?
Well, historians have differed on this. I think it was very important because it was far more deeply embedded in Virginia than some historians have said. I think there were more people practicing it. Primogeniture is, of course, a whole estate goes to the eldest son, and entail keeps the estate in the stem line of the family, and so that nobody really owns it. It's what was the basis of the English aristocracy.
Right.
And Jefferson came into authority in 1776 wanting to do away with that. He did. He and his colleagues abolished these. And when Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, he made a great deal of this. Now, historians have played this down because they said, well, a lot of people, they were docking entails and they weren't really counting for much. But I think it did mean something, and it certainly meant something culturally, psychologically, to do away with what seemed to be aristocratic measures, legal measures that maintained an aristocracy. That had, I think, a powerful psychological effect. And a lot of other states, half a dozen or more. New England never had those legal devices, but other states did, and the abolition of them, I think, was symptomatically important or psychologically important for Republican government.
Going back to your earlier comments on the causes for the fall of Rome, do Americans today possess enough virtue to continue operating the Republic as the founders intended?
The concept of Roman virtue, I think we would find unacceptable. And I think what we've come to understand is that kind of Roman virtue, which meant self-sacrifice, is almost impossible to sustain. That is, the people have to be willing to give up their selfish interests for the sake of the public good. I think most theorists would say that's almost asking too much of human nature, that we've worked out a kind of Adam Smith solution. That is to say, people can follow their private interests, and collectively that can work out to the public good. I think that's an insight that
Post-Adam
the
Smith.
Romans did not have, and most of the Americans in the late 18th century didn't have. That is, I think, something that worked out through experience. I don't think anyone expects people to be selfless. But there has to be something of that, or you wouldn't be able to sustain your society. You can't have everybody, especially you can't have it at government level, people using their public
to
office
enrich
for
themselves.
private gain. That's what we mean by corruption. And we see so many states around the world, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, where rulers get into power and use the office to simply make money for themselves. That, I think, would be intolerable for the democracies, and for the most part, we punish that kind of behavior.
Well, while in office, but there seems to be no holds barred once one leaves office to enrich themselves.
Well, that's right. Speech making and so on, there are other ways of making money, and it'd be difficult to stop that unless you... I mean, the Romans would have found ways of dealing with that, but we would find that repressive.
Going back to the American character, has there ever been a people as committed as Americans to enterprise? And are we at risk of losing our entrepreneurial vigor?
Well, that's a good question, and of course, I think we have been, in that sense, the freest people in terms of free enterprise. We've always mistrusted government more than Europeans, and as a consequence, our economy has flourished. At the same time, we've had abuses that come from that, but nonetheless, there's no doubt that we are more committed to work as a value, more committed to anti-aristocratic views, more bourgeois, for example. You know, the English academics and intellectuals made fun of Margaret Thatcher because she was a greengrocer's daughter. Well, Americans wouldn't do that, generally. The only ones that do that are academics, I'm afraid. They're the last aristocrats. That is, they make fun or mock people who make money, businessmen. And that, I think, is... We've generally not done that. When Coolidge said the business of America is business, that's been, I think, a reigning view, and it's been a source of the economic success.
Given the immense and almost impossible job of constraining the power of the federal government, are we becoming subjects, once again, not of a king and of his nobles, but of a bureaucracy and its apparatchiks? Well,
there's no doubt that the restraints and regulations have led to... I don't think we're quite a monarchy, because there are ways of resisting this, and Americans have found ways to do that. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that government is much more powerful in our lives than it ever was before. And it doesn't seem likely that you're able to reverse that easily. But there is a strong current of anti-bureaucratic feeling, anti-regulatory feeling that I think is still powerful in America.
We just celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, marking the beginning of Anglosphere liberty. Make a prediction for us. Will there still be an Anglosphere straddling the globe that will celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, historians are very good at predicting, but we can only hope so. The country is, relative to the rest of the world, we're in pretty good shape. I think because Magna Carta, and that is a symbolic thing, the English common law and the English heritage that was passed on to us has been crucial. When you look around the world, the strongest democracies are the offshoots of England. Whether you're talking about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the United States, and even India, was affected by the Raj, by British control over India for years. So England has been, I think, influential in many ways, and I think that kind of feeling for liberty, which is what it started with the English, has persisted.
Gordon, is the era of American exceptionalism coming to a close?
Well, that's hard to know, but American exceptionalism came out of the Revolution, that we were exceptional in the sense that we differed from Europe, and we differed from Great Britain, and that's where we were an exceptional nation. And that exceptionalism has continued on, I think, that sense that we are more liberty-loving, that we are freer, but we are becoming, you might say, Europeanized, but there's still a great deal of difference between us and the European nations. And I think insofar as those differences continue, we will be thought of, or we can think of ourselves as exceptional.
Gordon, I want to wish you a happy Independence Day. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Bill.
That was renowned Revolutionary War scholar Gordon Wood here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, Howard Cowboy Wooldridge explains how his years on the police force fighting the failed war on drugs launched his Pole Revere ride to end drug prohibition. Stay tuned.